Well, good morning, Lakeland. I am so excited for you today. I said that during my sabbatical, you were going to have some special treats. This is one of those weeks because today you're going to hear from Mark White. Mark is the founding and senior pastor out at The Ridge. It's a multi-campus church. It's got sites in Greenfield as well as Oak Creek. Mark is such a great friend of mine and has been such an encouragement to me in my journey. In fact, there's so many things that Mark has actually spoken into my life and helped Lakeland make wise choices because of some of the best practices that The Ridge has figured out ahead of us. And so I'm so grateful for The Ridge. I'm so grateful for Mark. And I know you're going to be blessed by him this morning, by the words that he shares. And so would you just join me in putting your hands together and welcoming with me Mark White.
Well, what an honor it is to be here. I feel like I'm on sacred ground here, just being at this church. And I know this is sometimes hard to just realize the full extent of this when you're in the middle of something. But God is doing some really, really significant things here. And you are a part of something really special of what God is doing here. And so it's an honor for me to be here. And I'm telling you, as I'm sitting here during the service, now I can't sing or play an instrument, but I want to be on this team, all right, the arts team, because they are so good, and you guys are so blessed to have them as well. And I tell you, I love your pastor. I've known him for years. We've become very, very good friends, and he is such a special guy. You should feel very good about him taking a sabbatical right now and taking some time off and just kind of recharging his batteries a little bit. But because he's not here and because he probably won't see this, let me tell you 3 things about your pastor that maybe you might not know, all right? And so if he gets mad at me, who cares? He'll never invite me back anyways. All right, here's the first one. He is a hairy dude. Now, I know what you're thinking of. You're thinking, no, he doesn't have any hair. Oh, no. He gets his shirt off, and you're like, whoa, dude, what has happened to you, all of a sudden? In fact, in the pastor world, because this is what we do in the pastor world, we actually call him Esau, which means hairy, and because, man, that dude is just like, whoa. He came to speak at our church last summer, and he's spoken there a couple times, and I said, man, did you notice how hairy it is? And some gal goes, man, he is, man. The hair was sticking out of his shirt. I go, I know. He called me Esau. She didn't really think it was funny, but anyways, so he's a real hairy dude. The second thing is he is a very competitive guy. I mean, you get him in the sports type setting or any type of games or anything like that. I mean, that dude is really, really competitive. In fact, you may not realize this. He talks a lot of trash. And you know what? A lot of the stuff comes out of his mouth really is trash. But he is just a really, really competitive guy. And then here's the third thing. He is better off stage than he is on stage. And I tell you, he's fantastic on stage. But he is a better person off stage. I mean, he really does love God. He loves his family. He loves you more than you can realize. And so, even have a little fun at his expense. I'm telling you what, you guys are so blessed to have a pastor like him, just how much he loves you and all that stuff. So if you'll do me a favor, just over the next couple weeks, just be committed to praying for him and his family, that God would just really just speak into him during this time away, and as he's ready to come back here and just continue to lead you guys forward. Now, today we are continuing a series called Heroes. So show of hands, how many of you like superhero movies? I mean, let's be honest. I know, and you say, well, I just take the kids there, that's why I go. But no, you really like them. Let's be honest. You like superhero movies. Now, personally, I love superhero movies. I don't care if it's DC or if it's Marvel, or I'm going to go and see a superhero movie. And when I'm done with them, I don't know how you feel, because there's just something that is stirred in me when I see a superhero movie. I'm like, I got to go save the world. I want to do something significant. I want to make something happen. But over the course of this series, the heroes that we're talking about are very different, and yet I think much more impactful than superheroes. These heroes are called heroes of the faith. In fact, they're all found in a chapter of the Bible. It's in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, sometimes called the faith chapter. And if you've read this chapter before, you can be reading this chapter. It's talking about all these heroes of the faith, heroes of the faith. There's a part of us where there's like this disconnect that begins to happen. It's kind of like when we see a superhero movie, we're like, oh, I'd want to be a superhero. But, the disconnect is we don't really have any superpowers that they do. And when you read this chapter, the disconnect is like, hey, man, they're heroes of the faith, but I'm just kind of me. And I'm not really a hero, and no one's going to write about my faith or anything like that. And so there can be this disconnect. But what I love about the hero that I'm going to talk about today is that the more we read his story, the more we discover how much in common we have with this person. In other words, this is a hero that is very relatable for all of us. And what I also love about this hero is that probably all of us have heard of this hero. Even if you're not a Bible person or you wouldn't consider yourself a religious person, you've probably heard of this hero as well. He's actually the second most mentioned person in all the Bible behind Jesus. But what's interesting is in our faith chapter, he gets a very small mention. And so here's the mention of his name, Hebrews chapter 11. Here's what the writer of Hebrews says. It says, hey, and what more shall I say? Because the writer's been talking about Abraham, and he's been talking about a whole bunch of heroes. What more shall I say? And so now he's just going to throw in a bunch of names. I don't even have time to tell you about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets. And so I'm going to talk about David. And as I talk about David, we're going to talk about one of the most well-known stories in all the Bible. Once again, even if you're not a church person or a Bible person, you have probably heard of this story. I'm going to talk about the story of David versus the giant Goliath. Now, before I get there, let me give you some much needed background in our story. At this time in Israel's history, they had a king, and his name was King Saul. But King Saul made a bunch of very, very bad decisions, and so God looks at King Saul and he goes, you know what, I need to make a pitching change here. I'm going to the bullpen, and so as a result, he goes to the bullpen, and he's going to replace him. And so he goes to a guy named Samuel, a prophet, and he says, hey, Samuel, I want you to go to Bethlehem, and I want you to go to a guy named Jesse's house. And so this is actually what Samuel does. And Samuel says to Jesse, he says, hey, listen, I want you to gather all your sons here because one of them is going to be the next king. And so Jesse gets his sons, and he lines them up in a row. And Samuel, he looks at the oldest son of Jesse, his name is Eliab, and he looks at him, and he goes, oh, man, this guy, he's got the look, he's got the physique. I mean, look at his biceps and all this stuff. He said he's got the experience. He's like, surely this has got to be the guy. And right about when Samuel's going to go, hey, Eliab, you're the guy, God gives Samuel a little bit of a nudge. And here's what he says to him. He says this. He says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance. Now, have you ever noticed that when you go see a superhero movie, have you noticed that all the superheroes are pretty attractive? They have a really good-looking outward appearance. I mean, can you imagine an unattractive Thor? Even though if you saw, the last Avengers movie, he was somewhat unattractive. But can you imagine an unattractive Thor? Can you imagine an unattractive Superman or Wonder Woman? No, we can't. They're all very attractive. Plus, they all have some sort of supernatural power. But God looks at Samuel and he says, I don't care about that stuff. Let me tell you what I care about when I'm looking for a hero. He says this. He says, hey, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We look at the outward appearance of someone, but God looks at the inward of someone. Now, this shouldn't surprise any of us because we've all heard stories or read stories, or maybe you've even experienced this in your own life, where we've seen a business leader or an athlete or a politician, a parent or a pastor, and they had some sort of moral failure or they were involved in some sort of scandal, and it wrecked their career, they lost all their influence. Well, that fall had nothing to do with the outward appearance. It had everything to do with what was going on inside of them. And so Samuel, he looks at Eliab and he goes, you are not the guy. And then he has 6 other sons and he's like, okay, none of them are it. Hey, Jesse, is this all you got? Because none of them are it. And Jesse's like, yeah, this is all. Oh, no, wait a minute. Hold on. I got one more. He's the youngest, but he's out tending sheep. And Samuel goes, well, go get him. And so Jesse goes and gets David. He comes in, he is smelling like sheep. He comes in and Samuel looks at him, he goes, you're the guy. This 15-year-old sheep herder, the forgotten son, becomes God's choice to be the next king. All because God saw something in David that no one else was looking for. Now, as we look at superhero movies and we think about superhero stories, there's usually a part in a superhero story where they have yet to fully embrace their superhero identity yet. And they can't embrace their superhero identity yet because before they do, they have to overcome some giant obstacle in their life. And then when they overcome this giant obstacle, they discover, he goes, I can be a hero. In fact, I am a hero. Well, the same thing is true with our guy, David. David's giant obstacle is that he has to defeat an actual giant. Now, let me tell you why this is important for us. Every one of us comes in here today with some sort of giant that we are facing in our lives. You know, for some of you, your giant is fear. Maybe it's a fear of rejection. Maybe it's a fear of commitment. Maybe it's a fear of failure. You know, maybe it's a fear of the future. Maybe it's a fear of something bad happening to someone in your life, or maybe even yourself. You know, for some of you, your giant is a major decision that you're in the process of making right now. And, you know, there are people around you, they're saying, the answer is yes, you need to move forward, you need to move forward. But there's something in you that's sensing no. There's a red flag in there. But you know, if you make that decision, it may cost you something, or maybe even someone. You know, for some of you, your giant is a rebellious teenager. Or for some of you, your giant is a season of change you're going through in your life right now. It's like you're going to a new job, or you're thinking of moving. I mean, there's just so much uncertainty swirling around in your life right now as you think about this new season. You know, for some of you, your giant is an addiction. Maybe it's an addiction that has just got a stronghold over you, or maybe it's got its stronghold over someone you love. Or maybe for some of you, your giant is control. And you know, you're following Jesus, but let's be honest, you know, you're kind of trusting him in the things that you have really no control over anyways, and you're not really trusting him in the things that you do have control over. That giant, whatever it is or whoever it is, stands in the way of us becoming the more that both God and we want. And what we're going to discover through David's story is how to defeat the giants in our own lives. And so as we move into the story, here's what's going on. You got the Israelites and the Philistines are at war with each other. And the Philistines are the bitter enemies of the Israelites. And things have gotten so tense, there's a standoff. And so here's what the writer of 1 Samuel says. He says this. He says, Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. Now, the valley of Elah was a vast canyon. It was about a mile wide. And so on one side, you had the Israelite army, and on the other side, you had the Philistine army. And then we're introduced to our giant. It says, and a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath. He was a champion because he was the very best that they had, came out to the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. In other words, he was about 9.5 feet tall. I mean, if you're a Bucks fan, I know some of you are Bulls fans because we're kind of in the Illinois area as well. I mean, if you're a Bucks fan, you want him on your team. I mean, this is how tall and athletic this guy is. And then it says his spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And so 600 shekels, it's kind of the equivalent of, it's about 6 feet long, this spear is, and it weighs in between 25 and 30 pounds. Now, this wasn't a throwing javelin. This was a killing spear. And a lot of times, the best warriors would be on the first rank of things. But Goliath, because of his height, he actually was on the second rank in battle. And so, because he was so tall, he could just reach over and he could just kill and kill and kill and kill. But on this particular day, instead of going out to the second rank or even the first rank, he actually steps forward and he issues a challenge to the Israelites. And here's the challenge. It says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. And so it was a custom, a very common custom back then, that one person would step forward and they would represent the entire army. And this was a winner-take-all proposition. Well, the obvious person to step forward for the Philistines was their champion, Goliath. However, the question was, well, who would step forward for the Israelites? Now, the obvious answer was actually King Saul. As we read about what the writers describe about King Saul, it's that he was head and shoulders above the rest, and so he was the obvious choice. However, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, Saul, their leader, I don't know what leadership books that he was reading or podcasts that he was listening to, but whichever ones he was, it was, hey, when the going gets tough, send someone else. Because this is kind of his philosophy, you know? He's like, I'm not going out there and fighting this dude. And so he creates this incentive package for anyone who is willing to fight against Goliath. And the incentive package includes a lot of money, tax exemption for life, and his daughter's hand in marriage, which, if you read the rest of the story, that is not an incentive, let me tell you, because she was not a catch. And then the writer says this, for 40 days, the Philistines came forward every morning and every evening and took his stands. And so Goliath, he just didn't issue this challenge once and then kind of step back and go, okay, when's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? It was like every morning, every day, for 40 days, he did this, which means for 40 days, the Israelites lived in fear and defeat. Now, you know what I love about this picture, this scene? This is a great picture of what the giants look like in our lives. I mean, it's not like they just come once and then they like go away and we never have to deal with them ever again. It's like they come in the morning and then they come in the afternoon and then they come in the evening and sometimes they even come when we're sleeping. I mean, you know, they just come over and over again, try to discourage and intimidate us. I mean, you think about just the giant of fear and worry for a minute. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, you know, I dealt with that and then it's gone and then it comes back again. Sometimes it's even worse and it just comes back and it comes back and it comes back. And this is exactly what's going on here. However, on day 41, a day that started out like all the other 40, things are about to change not only for the Israelites, but for David as well. Well, meanwhile, about 10 or 15 miles away from all of this, David is out tending sheep. And as I mentioned earlier, he's about 15 at the time. He just got his learner's permit, you know, so his dad's got to pay more insurance that he didn't want to pay. But he's got his learner's permit at the time. He's 15, and he has been appointed to be the next king, but he's as far away from the palace as possible because he's still tending sheep. And what David would do during his idle time, because there was a lot of idle time tending sheep, he would take his slingshot, and he would just practice it over and over and over again. Well, on day 41, like I said, David has no idea what's going on. His father sends for him. And his father says, hey, listen, I got this care package. I want you to take this care package to your brothers at the Valley of Elah because they were in the Israelite army. And so David, he goes to the Valley of Elah and he hears Goliath taunting. Now understand, David has never heard Goliath taunt before for the last 40 days. And so here's David's reaction. It says this. It says, David asked the men standing near him, hey, what will be done for this man who kills the Philistine and removes, I love this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Now, this is David's way of saying, who's this guy who's outside the covenant of God? And it's like, hey, who does this guy think he is? And why haven't any of you done anything about this guy? And so he's like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now notice how when David sees this thing, he doesn't see this as a David versus Goliath thing. He sees this as a Goliath versus God thing. And I also want you to notice, the question David asked, nobody else asked this question. Because David saw something that no one else could see. And then here's what happens next. It says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men. Now remember, Eliab is the brother who Samuel's like, hey, you're not the guy. And then Eliab had to sit there and watch Samuel anoint his youngest brother to be king, which for an older brother to see that's hard for any older brother to grasp and have to deal with. And so as a result, he begins to criticize David. And so he says, he burned with anger at him. It's just a way of criticizing. And then he says, hey, why have you come down here? And he starts to criticize his motives. He says, David, why are you really here? And then he says, hey, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in your fields? He tries to humiliate him. He says, hey, David, shouldn't you go back to your little sheep that you need to watch while the men here stay in battle? And then he gets really, really nasty with David. And he says this, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle. In other words, David, you just came down here for the excitement of it all. And it's here where our story begins to really intersect with our hero David's story. You see, when we begin to take steps to deal with the giants in our lives, when we begin to decide that, hey, we're going to really pursue that dream, when we decide that we're going to make changes in our life, when we're going to reprioritize some things, when we decide that we're going to actually start seriously following God in our life, there's a good chance there's going to be some people that are threatened by that whole thing. There's a good chance that there are going to be some people who they don't really care for the decisions that we make, and sometimes those people are going to be the people closest to us, and as a result, they're going to criticize us for us. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of who and when. And this is what happened to David, and it's going to happen to us. Now, how did David deal with the criticism? David just kind of ignores his brother, and he just starts to move on because he knows the battle that he's going to face is not with his brother. Well, word gets back to King Saul. And one of his commanders goes, hey, your majesty, I just want to let you know I've got good news and I've got bad news for you. And the good news is we have someone who has stepped forward and who wants to fight Goliath. And Saul's like, well, what's the bad news? Well, it's the teenage shepherd boy, David. And right when he says this, David walks in. It's probably just this incredible scene. David walks in. He's got no scars, no wounds, nothing to indicate that he's ever been in battle before. I mean, he is no soldier. And as a result, Saul's extremely disappointed. And as a result, he just dismisses David right away. And he says this. He says, hey, you're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth. Saul's like, David, hey, glad you're here, but you can't do this. And he gives him all these reasons why. He's like, hey, David, he's a champion, you're a child, and probably a chump at that. And he's like, hey, David, I just want to let you know, this guy has all this battle experience. David, you've never even been in a fight before. Now, once again, this is where our story intersects with David's story. When we begin to take steps to defeat the giants in our lives, there are going to be people around us that say, here's why you can't, here's why you shouldn't, and they're going to give us all the reasons why. But David, love David, he will not be denied. Here's his response. He says, but David said to Saul, in other words, he already had a response ready because he knew what was coming. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came. Now, let me just hit the pause button here for a minute. And let me give you something that your Pastor Josh, or insight that your Pastor Josh would never be able to give you, what most scholars would never give you, but let me give it to you because the church I come from, this is the depth that we go to when we are reading the Bible. Let me tell you this. I think this text shows that David was actually the first Green Bay Packer football player. And here's how I know this. It says he was fighting lions and bears. And so he was fighting all the way back then. Just a little insight I just wanted to throw out at you. All right. So when a lion or a bear came and carried off sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. See, they were beating him way back then. Just want to let you know that. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. In other words, he is having this aha moment right here because he has defied the armies of the living God. You see, here's what David realized at this moment, is that God uses the small things from our past to prepare us for the big things in the future. You see, David sees Goliath, and all of a sudden it's like all the dots began to connect for him. And he was like, oh man, I get it now. That's why God had me tending sheep all that time. And during that time, I thought it was so unimportant and so insignificant and so small. But while I was attending sheep, I had to fight lions and bears. Now I look at Goliath, how is he any different from any of them? Years ago, I had one of my own aha moments. Before I was a pastor, I was actually in the corporate world for quite some time. And then I made the transition to become a pastor. And during that time early on, I was approached about starting a new church from scratch. And this is something I'd never done before or even thought about doing. And the failure rate, they have in the new church world, they have these things called failure rate. Very positive way of looking at it. You know, the failure rate was anywhere from 60 to 85%, you know. And so I'm being asked to do this and pray about and all this stuff. Well, during that time, a very close friend of mine, he asked me this question. His question was this: have you ever started anything from scratch before? in your life. And it was like when he said that, this light bulb went on. I was like, oh yeah, hey, my corporate career, that's all I did. And I began to list all these things that I was asked to do to start things from scratch. And before that time, I had never seen a connection from that part of my life, the corporate part, to the church part. And then I realized at that point, because you never realize it when it's going on, that God had me doing that because he was preparing me for something that he had in the future. And this isn't just a me thing, and this isn't just a David thing. This is a you thing as well. You know, for some of us, we're in jobs right now, and we're just going, why am I doing this job? You know, for some of you, you're serving in positions right now, and you're going, I could be doing so much more. You know, for some of us, we're dealing with some very difficult situations in our life, situations that we'd rather not do and deal with, but we're leaning in anyways, and we're going to deal with them anyways, and hopefully a way that's going to honor God. And for some of us, speaking of honoring God, we are honoring God with areas of our life, and it's just hard, and it just feels like it's unimportant, and it's not going anywhere. Listen, whatever that might be for you, stay the course. Stay the course. Stay faithful, because I'm telling you, and you don't know when it's happening at the time, that God is going to use the small things from our past because he is using them to prepare us for some of the things he has for the future. So David, he looks at King Saul and he says, hey, pick me, I'll go. Hey, I'm willing, King Saul, to do what no one in your army is willing to do. And I'm willing to do, King Saul, what honestly you aren't willing to do. And Saul looks at David and he goes, well, what other options do we have? And so 15-year-old, confident and humble David, he makes his way down to the valley of Elah. And we can only imagine the reaction of the Philistine army. I mean, they're looking at him and they start laughing. They go, are you kidding me? A teenager with no armor coming out here? Is this a stinking joke? And we can't imagine the reaction of the Israelite soldiers. And they're going, we're dead. We're doomed. Are you kidding? Hey, King Saul, did you not know what's at stake here? And you have allowed this boy to represent us. And so David runs down there. And Goliath starts his taunt. And he taunts, and he taunts, and he taunts. And David waits, and David waits, and David waits. And then finally he responds, and here's what he says. He says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know, which is interesting, because the whole world does now know today. They most know the story. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And then David takes that sling that he had been practicing for years while tending sheep, and he uses it to kill Goliath just as he predicted. And then David instantly becomes the most famous man in Israel, and he also becomes the most feared man among the Philistines. All because David was willing to do what Saul and the other soldiers were not willing to do. All because David saw what no one else was looking for. And it's found in that phrase, for the battle is the Lord's. You know, when we read a story like this, one of the questions that you need to ask is, okay, David, how were you able to have such confidence to defeat the giant? I mean, David, how were you able to see what no one else could see? Well, the reason that is because David lived with an assumption that he carried with him his entire life. Even as a teenager, he wrapped his life and his faith around this assumption. And here's what the assumption was: that the person whose confidence is in the Lord need not fear, even when there is something to fear. You see, this story isn't about David's raw courage or his skill with the sling or his talent and charisma. This is a story about God. And as we bridge this story to our story, this isn't a story about our raw courage or our bold faith. This isn't a story about our talent and charisma and how resourced we are. This is a story, if we let it, This is a story about what God can do in any person's life whose confidence is fully in him. You know, the interesting thing is that years later, David would write some songs. We know them as Psalms. And so what's cool about David's story is we just don't know what he said and did. We get into what he was thinking. We get into what his emotions were during this time. And one of the Psalms that he wrote actually gets us inside of what he was thinking during this time. Here's what he documented. This is so powerful. He says this. He says, "In you, Lord my God, I put my trust." Now that word trust is just another word for confidence. And so it's like, hey, David, where did your confidence come from? He's like, well, that's easy. It came from the Lord. And then a few verses later, he writes this. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame. Now, David's a king at this time when he writes this. And what he writes next, kings didn't write these things because they were kings. And he says this, guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are my God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. In the midst of David's confidence is this amazing humility. God, guide me. God, teach me. Hey, God, my charisma, it's not enough to defeat the giants in my life. And God, hey, my talent and my skill is not enough to defeat the giants in my life. My confidence is in you all day long. Well, why is that, David? Because my giants are bigger than me, but they are not bigger than God. So let me put a couple verses back up from this psalm again. And I want us to read these words just together as a church community. So when I say go, let's read these together. Ready, go. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. Just one more time. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. One of the giants I face every single day, faced it before I walked on stage here, is just the fear of, the giant of, I don't feel like I have what it takes. Now, a lot of men face that giant, and I do as well. Well, it got so bad that over the last couple of months, I decided to write out what I call just some declaration statements. You may give them some other names, but they're just declaration statements. And they're declaration statements that I wrote on a card, a couple index cards. There's 6 of them. And the declaration statements are about who God is, and the truth about, because of who God is, the truth about who I am because of who God is. And I read these every single morning. As I said before I came here, I read them as well. And one of them is almost word for word what David said there. And these aren't power of positive thinking type things. Positive thinking is wonderful. I hope you're a positive thinker. It's great. But positive thinking isn't enough. This is power of truthful thinking. Because truthful thinking with its power, just like it did in David's life, has the power to defeat any giant in our lives. You see, this right here, what we're talking about, this was the secret for David's life. And it's the secret for defeating all the giants in our lives. I want you to imagine that you get up tomorrow, and before you head out the door, you just make this declaration. In you, Lord my God, in you, Lord, in you I place my trust. Imagine you're on your way to work tomorrow, and there's so much uncertainty going on in your life right now, and there's so much doubt, and there's so much like, I don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow, and if we're gonna make this, and what about this, and I have no control over this. You know, what about even in the midst of your greatest successes, that you go, oh, in you, Lord my God, in you, Lord my God. And you make that declaration. You know, maybe for you, just imagine making this declaration and the world is going against you and people are criticizing you and they're doubting you and they're saying all the reasons why you can't. And you just say, in you, Lord my God, in you, Lord my God, you, Lord my God. You know, David was a hero. He was a hero. But he was a very flawed one at that. In fact, as we read his story, we see that he tried to control outcomes, and it cost him and others so much pain and so much misery. But in the midst of his flaws, David always came back to where his confidence came from. And that confidence allowed him to defeat any giant that he faced in his life. He always came back to this. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust, my hope is in you all day long. Let me pray for us. And Father, that's our prayer. as we all come in here with giants. And God, we call them giants because they're bigger than us. And we've tried to fight them, we've tried to control them, tried to ignore them even. For some, we've just tried to live with them and go, this is just kind of normal, this is the way life is going to be. But Father, the giants in our lives are actually a reason. They're a symbol. They're a reminder that we're to look for you because, in all honesty, God, you are the giant slayer. Our giants may be bigger than us, but they are not bigger than you. God, I pray you'd move in this church and that we would become people that don't just settle for living with the giants, but we come giant slayers along with you. Because God, it is in you. It is in you. We can put our hope and we can put our trust. And just like David did throughout his life, we can see the giants one after another defeated in our lives, and we can experience the full victory that is found in you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Lakeland, would you thank Mark White with me? Awesome. Powerful, powerful truths as we face down our giants and where confidence comes from. If you want to take your first step towards facing down your giant, we have prayer partners in the back that would love to pray with you. Otherwise, thanks for being with us this weekend, and we'll see you next week.